Matthew 27:57-66. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how the impostor said, while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people, 'He has risen from the dead,' and the last fraud will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. So by this point, you might be wondering, is this the end of the story? So they did it. They killed him. He's dead. And now the sun is setting, but thankfully in God's providence, he provided a very generous, wealthy man named Joseph who took initiative and assumed total responsibility to not only physically handle Jesus' beaten up, bloodied body, but invested his own money for a burial site. Jesus was poor, and so were his disciples, so a man of means was required in this moment. Now, whatever your feelings are about worldly wealth, we know that it couldn't be all that terrible in the strictest sense because it was the very means that God used to fulfill Isaiah 53:9, which I'll quickly read for us. "And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth." You know, we see here this man about Joseph in Mark's account that he had taken courage when asking Pilate for the body. He was secretly afraid of the Jews. And so what I think about is, how is a rich man who clearly has access to political figures afraid of these religious Jews? I think this might have to say something about how dangerous the forces are against those who profess Christ. Now, meanwhile, his mother, she sits by the opposite the tomb, seeing it all come to a close. And it's just the worst, really. I mean, not just seeing your child buried, but killed. And killed in the fashion that he was killed. And so this part here is not scripture, but I think about this as the night is settling in and the Pharisees, they're gathered together, they're ruminating on how they can basically seal the deal. All right, they're anxious. They want to make sure that this imposter does not return. It seems like they're the only ones right now who remember what Jesus had said about this third day, that he was going to rise on the third day. And they didn't want to believe it because they knew what the implications of that would be. So what did they do? The very next day, they went to the authorities. Not to Pilate, not to his mother, but to the authorities. Now that's political correctness at its best. When they should have been in the temple attending to their sins because this was the Sabbath, they were devising a plan to ensure that you and I would have no hope in ours. Now here's Pilate. He's the man in the middle. You know, Pilate worked it out both with Joseph by giving him the body of Jesus, and he worked it out with the Pharisees. You know, he's taken both sides. This is really convenient. So the disciples, where are they? Do you notice that not one of them is here? And it seems noteworthy to me, and what we even pick up in Luke's account of this whole narrative, one of them is that they seem to have forgotten about what Jesus had taught them concerning what the gospel narrative is and the things that must take place. And so too, their hopes were dashed. They were what the Greek says, skruthopos, which simply means of a sad and gloomy countenance. Maybe a more modern term would be depressed. You know, the one that they had hoped would redeem Israel was not here, and so they basically went back about their lives. You know, I say all this to say something about worship. And worship in a crisis when it really matters. Now, Paul Tripp once said, human beings who are by very nature worshipers. You know, worship is not something we do, it defines who we are. You cannot divide human beings into those who worship and to those who do not. Everybody worships. It's just a matter of what or of whom. So here we are, 4 kinds of responses, 4 different sorts of worshipers in the midst of this crisis of death. So let me quickly summarize them for us. We have the Pharisees. They're skeptical, they're anxious, they're ready to deny. You have Pilate. He's the man in the middle. He's political, he's polite. Then you have Mary and Joseph, who are probably most similar of these 4 different groups of people. Okay, Mary's waiting, she's seemingly hopeful, she's lamenting, but not totally sure whether Jesus will raise. And then you have Joseph, who is dutiful. He's courageous. I mean, he took initiative to bury Jesus himself. He was a disciple. And then you have the 12 disciples who, again, they're nowhere to be seen here. From what we can gather, they're depressed, they're downcast, and they're seemingly without hope as well. So here we are, crisis. Crisis has a unique way of revealing the sort of worshiper that we are. And crisis, death is a crisis because it reveals at least 2 things about us. One, you and I were limited and we're finite. And death is going to come at us as well someday. And secondly, we're powerless to do anything about it. So where do you cling to? What do you hope for as you face the prospect of your own death? As you look even at the death of Jesus, we have to answer the question, what is our hope in life and in death? We need something that's going to take us beyond. And that's the beautiful story of the gospel. A life beyond the grave. So here we are, dear friend. We are now nearing the end of Passion Week. And if there's any central takeaway from all these activities that we would want you to receive is greater clarity about what this is all about, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ. But let me put even just a little bit of a sharper point on this. The gospel is about what happens after Saturday, which is the resurrection. And because the gospel is true, which means the resurrection actually happened, you and I, we are now enabled to live beyond Saturday, but have now a spirit of worship that is filled with substance and with meaning that lasts forever. So the gospel does not mean that all of our problems go away. Death still occurs, crises happen. The full fallout of Genesis 3, it still lingers with us today. Rather, the gospel means that you and I have a hope that touches the deepest parts of who we are. And we're given the life breath we need to live forever. So that even when we are faced with the crises such as sickness, death, and disease, we have a hope. We're not given in to despair. We're not given into anger or unresolved lament. Because the gospel, we can now live for a life beyond the sun. And because the gospel, we can now face our fears, and deal with all of the fleshly, earthly, sinful desires because they've been overcome by someone greater, someone eternal. That's Jesus. You see, the death and burial of Jesus, it forces the hand for us to deal with the sort of worshiper that we are when we're faced with the crisis of death. And so where do you stand when you're faced with the crisis of the death of Jesus? If you're not sure, then I invite you to come worship with us tomorrow, where hopefully you will hear the greatest news story you've ever heard in your life, and maybe either receive some correction or hopefully receive a new living hope. But if you do know the end of the story, then I invite even you also to come worship with us, where we will hear once again that beautiful gospel storyline that fills our hope and gives us joy. It's the thing we look forward to, where we hear really the resurrection of Jesus Christ.